So, welcome to the Analytical Rebuttals lecture, everyone. This lecture is basically just going to be about how to give good responses to your opponent's case, even when they're reading arguments that you don't necessarily have blocks for, or if you don't have any blocks at all, then, analytics are particularly helpful. Oh, let me link the slideshow so you guys can follow along. Sorry. Um, all right, I'll just put the link in the chat. All right, this lecture shouldn't take a terribly long time, so let's just get into it. So, like I just said, the main purpose of analytics is to respond to arguments that you don't have a lot of prep for. And there are some situations where even when you do have prep, you're going to want to add on more analytics, especially if you think of good ones in round, right? So if you don't have prep, obviously you have to go for pure analytics. And then there's certain situations where you want to add analytics on to your prep that already exists. For example, evidence index, right? If your author reads or if your opponents read an author that is obviously biased for whatever reason, like for example, I remember on the high-speed rail topic, a lot of people were citing this one author that was literally employed by a high-speed rail company. Or there was this one study that was commonly cited where the authors literally came back later and revoked their claims. You don't need a piece of evidence or a card for that. If you like know that it's true, you can say that as an analytical indict and you know, sorry. And like that disproves the other team's evidence and gives you an advantage. The final case where analytics are really important is when there's like a huge gaping hole in their case that's really, really obvious. You can just point to and be like, that doesn't make any sense. This is super useful, especially in lay rounds, because if you can convince the judge that the opponents are contradicting themselves or make it seem like they don't know what they're talking about, the judge is way more likely to vote for you. So even when you do have prep for arguments, analytics are still good for evidence index, lay rounds, and contradictions in your opponent's case. Okay, building your block file based on your responses basically means a couple things. First of all, um, you should structure your block file so that you put the things you have the most responses to at the top, obviously. But what I like to do is also leave slots for common arguments I don't have responses to that I didn't prep out, either because I was just being lazy or because I ran out of time. That kind of gives me a space to put analytics for future rounds, right? So let's say I'm in a round and the other team reads some like random argument I've never heard before. I'm gonna write down whatever responses I read to that and put that in my block file for the future. So that's just a way to build your block file, and it's a useful tip. Okay. The process of analytics. One of the fundamental truths of every single debate round and every single debate case in history. Sorry, I forgot to give access to the slideshow. Give me 1 second. All right, that should fix it. Sorry about that. Okay. One of the fundamental truths of every single debate case in every single debate round is that there will be a logical jump, right? There is no coherent way ever in the history of debate for a debate team to get from, the International Criminal Court or I don't even remember, generative AI to nuclear war, climate change, extinction. There's always a logical jump somewhere. And sometimes really good teams are good at making that hard to catch and backing it up with evidence, but there's always a logical jump, right? So the first thing you want to do is be confident when you're flowing. Pay attention to those logical jumps and just like attack them as much as you can, whether that's in Crossfire or in your analytics themselves. So that's why 1A says follow hunches. If something just doesn't sound right, right? If your opponents, even if they have evidence, if your opponents are asserting that, like, oh, China will make the US mad one time and that will lead to nuclear war, that's something that doesn't sound right. Or this one trade agreement will fall through and no one will ever trust America ever again and that will lead to war. That doesn't sound right. And that's why the next step is to call for evidence, right? So a lot of people, and I mean, this is just getting worse in the activity the more and more it goes on. But a lot of people will power tag their evidence, they'll misconstrue their evidence, or they'll just read it in a way that's extremely misleading to what it says, right? For example, I think, for example, at Emory, this one team read a card that was one study of like 50 people, and they said, according to this study, everyone in Africa will starve by the year 2030. Like that's obviously not true, obviously not what it said. So call for evidence, read the evidence your opponents have, and make sure it actually says what they say it says. And then write that all down on your flow because you're not going to remember it later. So look for those logical jumps, look for bad piece of evidence. And then step two is to just follow the process, and we'll go over this more on the next slide. But basically, you want to break down every part of the argument, right? Every argument has a link chain. It starts with uniqueness, and it has to get to, and it starts with the uniqueness and the resolution, and the arguments always have to get to their impact, which, in tech debate is usually an extinction level impact. And that's where logical leaps always come from. Then A2 is really, really important. And this is probably the biggest thing that a lot of people miss when they're trying to debate, like using analytics. Just because the other team gives a warrant doesn't mean it's necessarily true, right? So a lot of people will come to me and they'll be like, hey, their case had no logical jumps. They had a warrant for everything. But again, some warrants are literal bullshit, or some evidence is just like completely fake. So, like, you can still call that out to the judge. That's still an analytic. If you say their warrant doesn't make any sense, you should prefer our logic because of X, Y, Z. And finally, post dates matter. Obviously, this isn't like purely analytic, but or when I say this isn't purely analytic, post dates matter basically means that if you know something happened, but you don't necessarily have a card for it, you can still bring it up in the context of the round. So, for example, at Stanford, this was the ICC topic. So there were a lot of arguments about Ukraine. And on the literal day the tournament started, the White House had a huge argument between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. And even though some people didn't have cards cut for that, they were still able to use it as an analytical response to be like, hey, literally 2 hours ago, Trump and Zelensky stormed out of the White House and Oval Office screaming at each other. Obviously, they're not going to be working together on a peace deal. That's an analytic, but it still postdates your opponent's evidence, and you have to explain that that matters because it's more recent and affects the world more. But let's talk more about the actual process of coming up with analytics. Oh, okay. Wait, we'll go back to that. Um, okay. Sorry. I clicked past slide. Okay. The actual process of giving analytics. So first, you need an argument. This is from a really, really old topic, like 4 or 5 years ago. So a lot of you might not be familiar with it. But the topic was that the Republic of Japan should revise Article 9 of its constitution. And at the time, and Japan has a provision in its constitution called Article 9, which basically says it can't have offensive military capabilities. So it's allowed to have like defense systems and like military troops, but it can't have like missiles, it can't have certain types of weapons, basically anything deemed to be offensive. And that's one of the reasons why Japan doesn't have nukes. So this argument was about foreign aid. So first of all, this was a neg argument. So the argument was basically that Japan gives foreign aid right now, but if they revise Article 9, then they'll be able to have an offensive military and they won't have to give out foreign aid anymore because like they can just use their military to build better relationships with people and form defense agreements rather than rely on foreign aid. And that means there's less foreign aid coming out of Japan and more poverty. Pretty simple argument, right? Article 9 revision, more military, less aid, more poverty. So to respond to an argument like this, you always start at the top and go down, and you look for the logical jumps. First, a non-unique. You should always be able to read a non-unique on like almost anything, right? Even if you don't have evidence, there should be some logical like circuit that like, hey, this is going to keep happening or this will never happen. It's absurd. So in this case, non-unique. Japan is going to give aid anyway, right? Because again, even if you don't have evidence for that, you can say, hey, judge, they themselves tell you Japan giving aid has brought it allies and brought it soft power. That means they're going to keep giving aid regardless, right? And this is an important thing to think about because often people's uniqueness will connect to their impact. Right. So again, with the like Ukraine argument I was talking about with the February ICC topic, because some of you might be more familiar with that. Um, that argument was that, like for those of you who aren't, that argument was that the US will make a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine unless we join the ICC, then the peace deal won't happen, and then there's war and everyone dies. The uniqueness is connected to the impact because the uniqueness is that we're making a peace deal now, and the impact is that without it, we all die. So you can give a non-unique there saying both sides will still be compelled to negotiate because they want to avoid nuclear war, right? They're not going to give up on a peace deal if they know it can solve nuclear war. That's a very good strategy. You can always go for it. Just a non-unique of countries are rational. They want to avoid whatever extinction impact our opponents are talking about. So they're still going to do whatever thing they were doing before. Or and you should also read it the other way, which is where it says Japan is not giving aid now. This one thing that confuses people here is that this combo kind of sounds like it contradicts itself, right? Japan will keep giving aid no matter what. Japan is not giving aid now. But the point is that it kind of puts your opponents in a sort of double bind, right? If they respond to the first thing by saying, "Oh, we say that or sorry, if they respond to the second thing by saying, "Oh, Japan is giving a lot of aid now," you can just say, "Cool, that means there's no way that one revision is going to take away all of it." Or if they respond to the first thing by saying, "Japan is on the brink of letting go of its aid," a lot of teams will make that brink argument. Then you can say, okay, then it's going to happen anyway, right? So that double bind is another very common analytic you can go for. Either this keeps happening no matter what, and like the argument doesn't matter, or it stops happening no matter what, and the argument doesn't matter. Either way, you don't vote for them. All right, so those are uniqueness level analytics. Then we go to the link, right? In this specific link is about Article 9 revision causing a pivot to hard power because Japan has an offensive military, right? Again, there's a couple ways you can target this link. First, the pivot is already happening, right? And again, like in this specific case, there's like a couple ways that you could, argue that to your judge, say that like, oh, Japan is building up its defensive military. Oh, Japan is already making defense pacts. Oh, Japan has standing partnerships with the US military that it uses to like promote hard power around the world. And then in the same kind of thought process of the double bind of the previous response, you can say that a, the pivot to hard power is coming now, but B, their link does nothing to actually change it. And again, this puts your opponent in a double bind. They either have to argue the pivot to hard power is going to happen, in which case you say, okay, well, it happens whether or not your argument exists, or they have to say it's not going to happen, in which case they just lose because their argument doesn't matter anymore. So you say, okay, your link's going to happen no matter what, or your argument doesn't affect your link. Then the last thing you can go for a lot of times is a link turn, which is something along the lines of like, oh, whatever link you're arguing happens that's bad is actually good. So in this case, they say Japan will pivot to hard power and stop giving out foreign aid. You can come up with a bunch of different reasons why a pivot to hard power is actually better. It creates more peace, more stability, whatever, right? And then finally, impact level arguments, right? Foreign aid especially is an impact that's super duper prone to analytics because foreign aid kind of sucks. So like, yeah, for example, other countries that aren't Japan will give out foreign aid. Foreign aid sucks. Yeah. But this applies to other impacts too. Even when you're dealing with like an extinction level impact, um, the internal link to get to that impact is really sketchy, right? So like, let me back up a little bit. There's four main parts to every argument, which we kind of already talked about: uniqueness, link, internal link, impact. And 9 times out of 10, the weakest part in all these super tech cases you see that are like pandemics, we're all gonna die, climate change, nuclear war, the weakest part is almost always the internal link, right? For example, in this case, even if we agree that Japan is going to pivot to Article 9 and like have more hard power, that definitely doesn't mean that all foreign aid everywhere will immediately vanish. Or in the Ukraine example I was giving earlier, right? Just because one peace deal falls through doesn't mean that Russia's suddenly going to launch nukes and trigger an all-out nuclear war that kills everyone. Or in a climate change example, right? Just because America increases its pollution by 3% doesn't mean all of a sudden all of our climate change bright lines have moved up and we're all going to die in 5 years, right? So people almost always overblow their internal links. Maybe their link is true, but there is almost but their interlink is almost always super weak because they try to connect it to extinction on a global scale, and that almost always does not work. So when you're doing analytics, yes, go top down. Yes, try to attack every part of your opponent's argument, but especially in those hyper tech cases, if you just spam responses on the internal link, that looks really, really good to both tech judges and lay judges. But especially, I'm talking about mostly for tech arguments, right? Okay, here's a couple types of like very, very common analytical responses that apply to almost everything. And a lot of them are attacking that internal link level I was talking about. So the first one is intervening actors. And this is basically the idea that other things and other people and other organizations can always solve the problem your opponents are talking about, right? In the example of climate change, let's say that like your opponent's argument is about China and Russia emitting a bunch of greenhouse gases. You can say, well, look, America's the world's biggest polluter, and if America slows down, then it'll be fine. Or the Paris Accords exist right now, right? Or, America passed the Inflation Reduction Act 2 years ago. We're already cutting our emissions. The point being that even in a world where the judge believes their entire argument, right? Let's say you had zero prep, you conceded their entire link, then they still shouldn't get access to their impact because other things will solve. And there's a couple other examples of what other things can solve. Domestic political capital, that's basically the argument that like, hey, even if, some politician loses a lot of credibility to make like deals on the world stage, they can still pass domestic laws and do good things. Or mutually assured destruction, which like to go back to that ICC Ukraine example, like, hey, even if we don't broker a peace deal right here, right now, because both Russia and the US know that if they launch nukes, everyone dies, they're not going to launch nukes, which means there's no nuclear war, which means they don't get access to their impact. And then finally, international organizations. Again, with the foreign aid thing I was just talking about, the impact there was like, oh, foreign aid vanishes and it kills millions of people. And you could say, oh, well, the IMF or the UN or NATO will step in and fill that void, or NATO's more for like defense agreements, right? But they'll step in and fill that void and they don't get access to their impact. And then the other one
A
here
lot
is
of people.
yes. Do you have a question?
Oh, sorry, my bad. I just accidentally muted.
Okay, all good. If you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute and ask, like at any time. Interrupt me. It's fine. Um, okay. Next is a solvency deficit. This basically means that the problem is so big that there's a 0% chance their link can solve it, right? The like again, this is on the internal link level, and it's one of the best ways to respond to these like big extinction level impact cases when you don't have prep, right? For example, climate change. Like I said, America increasing pollution by 3%, or this one specific law, that's not going to solve climate change. It's not the make or break, right? War scenarios. Just because, right, India signs this one law, the Artemis Accords, okay, that's kind of an old topic. I should pick something more recent as my example. Just because the African Union recognizes Somaliland doesn't mean that all of a sudden all this tension is going to snap and boil over. It's not the make or break, right? Just because this one clan in the northern region of Somaliland grows stronger doesn't mean war is going to happen. Just because China, or like for hegemony, right? Just because, and this gets brought up a lot in tech race arguments, and I use this response all the time. Just because like three Chinese companies have passed American companies, that doesn't mean that hegemony has suddenly flipped and China's the strongest country in the world, right? Or you can go one step further there and say just because Chinese hegemony occurs doesn't mean that's the sudden step to a war. We've had hegemony transition before without war. And that's like a past callback, which is something I'll talk more about later. And then finally, empirics. Okay. I guess that's what I'm talking about. Empirics are one of the best ways for you to make all of the analytics, everything we've talked about so far, like 5 to 10 times more believable in the judge's mind. Like the number of times I've used the Cold War as an example in rounds, and that's what won me the round is ridiculous. Because again, it's easy to sit here all day and be like, yeah, Judge, no one's going to launch a nuke because it's mutually assured destruction. And then your opponents will come up and argue that, oh, Russia feels really cornered, so they are going to launch a nuke. And you'll be like, no, they aren't. And you're just kind of going back and forth with no real way to break the clash. Empirics break that clash for you. Hey, in the Cold War, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and both sides stood down because of mutually assured destruction. Nobody wanted to see the world die. Hey, in 2010, when scientists found out that climate change was becoming a pressing problem, countries signed the Paris Accords. Yeah, empirics basically means like to answer a chat question, empirics basically means previous examples or past history, right? But yeah, in the past, countries signed the Paris Accords and committed to lower emissions, right? In the past, during the COVID pandemic, the United States funded vaccine research and countries came together with quarantine protocols to shut down the pandemic, right? Revert to those past empirics. When you're dealing with extinction level arguments, your best friend is the fact that humanity is not extinct. And we faced all of these threats before. So think, Why is humanity not extinct? And then apply it. That's also some fire rhetoric if you want to steal that in round. I use that a lot too. Like this has happened before. We're still here. We'll still be here after. So yeah, the two main things I want you to remember as far as types of easy analytics, intervening actors, other people and organizations that can solve, and solvency deficit, a reason why their argument either doesn't trigger their impact or can't fix their impact, depending on, which way their case is going. Okay. Finally, the cornerstone of literally every analytic in the history of ever is topic knowledge. So again, I know I was just talking about empirics, but the only way you can get empirics is by having this topic knowledge. And this applies to, again, everything we've talked about so far. When I talked about looking for logical jumps, when I talked about calling out BS evidence, when I talked about thinking about intervening actors, when I talked about solvency deficits, when I talked about going down their case, topic knowledge is the cornerstone of all of that, right? So first of all, to find logical jumps, you have to know about the topic. And as far as building topic knowledge, there's a lot of ways to do that. First of all, when you prep, you should kind of automatically build some topic knowledge just by like reading stuff and reading the news. Second of all, if you like spend 5 minutes a day to like browse news headlines, even if you don't like click on articles and read them, you just spend 5 days, open like CNN or something, flick through the headlines, be like, okay, interesting. The more like you research your debate topic, the more those news websites will feed you the stories that are related to the topic. So just by that, you should gain topic knowledge. And then obviously you can just spend some time like Googling things and reading about them to gain topic knowledge. But the closest rounds in both lay and tech debate are almost always won not by who has more prep, but by who knows the topic better. Because it shows in your speeches, it shows in crossfire, it shows in everything. So, as far as finding logical jumps, right, which is like the main point of analytics, topic knowledge is critical to that because you don't know that your opponent's making a logical jump if you don't know enough about the topic to know what they're talking about, right? So, for example, back to this like International Criminal Court example from February from Stanford, one of my opponents read an argument that said the International Criminal Court disenfranchises Latin American countries. And I was like, and me and my partner were like, wait a minute, that's not true. And we remembered and talked about, even though we didn't have evidence for it, we remembered and talked about a case from a Latin American country that the ICC has taken up in the past. And like, so we talked about that, and that's what won us that round, right? So when you go through when you're listening to your opponent's case, flowing it, if you have that topic knowledge, it's so much easier to say, that doesn't make sense. That's not what I remember. This evidence isn't consistent with what I know about the topic, right? And like I said, it contributes to intervening actors, solvency deficits, and empirics too. Because you can think, okay, what similar things have happened in the past, right? Obviously, there's some that are consistent. The nuclear war, the Cold War, the Paris Accords, those will always be there across every single debate topic. But in some cases, there are very specific similar events that you have to know about in order to compete at a high level. So, for example, the January topic this year was about the African Union recognizing Somaliland. And a lot of arguments were about, hey, if Somaliland secedes from Somalia, there will be a war and everyone will die. But in the last 20 years, two other countries in Africa have seceded, being Eritrea and South Sudan, and various things happened, right? I mean, they both had wars. They were varying degrees of casualties. Some got bigger, some didn't. In some cases, other countries stepped in some cases, they didn't. So you have to know about those events and like what happened surrounding them in order to be able to stand up to crossfire questions and like be coherent in round. And then what existing problems could exist with the opponent's case? This is more an idea of, hey, I read about this thing yesterday that like kind of nukes your case, right? So for example, recently, like not 2 weeks ago, like a month and a half ago, I think, on my timeline's probably off, but the White House signed a minerals deal with Ukraine. Let's say that happened in the middle of February. All of a sudden, the cooperation between the White House and Ukraine has gone up considerably, and that takes out a lot of the ICC Ukraine arguments that I was talking about earlier. So again, previous or past examples, that's just topic knowledge building on empirics. Right. Topic knowledge, the cornerstone of analytics. Just knowing more than your opponents is a huge advantage in crossfire and in giving responses. Okay. Real quick before we go on, there's a chat question asking, can you explain logic jumps? Sure. So the point I was trying to make with like saying logic jumps was basically that like most technical debate cases at high level on the national circuit will end in an impact of extinction, whether that's because a pandemic kills everyone, or nuclear war kills everyone, or climate change kills everyone, or in some particularly unhinged arguments, aliens kill everyone. But the point is, no debate topics that we debate ever are like tantamount to are like not tantamount. I don't know what the right word is, but like none of them are conducive to extinction level impacts, right? So like for example, the America joining the International Criminal Court is not going to cause extinction. Like just on a truth level, like if you're just ignoring the debate aspect of it, on a very truth level, you're like, that doesn't make any sense, right? Or generative AI in schools, that's going to cause extinction? No, it's not. That doesn't make any sense, right? So all of those arguments require jumps in logic to get from where they are to extinction. And normally, like I said, that jump in logic is in the internal link. For example, with this like Ukraine example I've been referencing a ton, the argument went, okay, the uniqueness is there's a peace deal happening right now. The link is the ICC destroys the peace deal. The internal link is Russia goes to war, and the impact is everyone dies. That might seem reasonable, but then you're like, wait, one peace deal falls through and all of a sudden Russia launches nukes at everyone and we die. That doesn't make sense. That's a jump in logic that you should exploit. So ask your opponent in Crossfire, hey, why does Russia suddenly start launching nukes? And then, so like, okay, let me clarify. As a first speaker in Crossfire, you should be following up on that instantly. Like, hey, why does Russia instantly launch nukes? And that sets your partner up for rebuttal to explain to the judge, hey, this doesn't make sense. There's no reason Russia would kill everyone, including themselves, because they got pissed off about one peace deal. So those are the logic jumps I'm talking about, and they're usually in the internal link, but not always. So make sure you're looking for them. Sometimes cases will have multiple logic jumps, and that's just better for you. So attack that. Also, another big type of logic jump that often happens is contradiction. When people say one thing earlier in their case and then contradict themselves later. So look out for that. Like for example, I I faced someone reading a case on the January topic about Somaliland. And they started by saying the UN is useless and can't do anything, and then their impact was about how the UN is going to solve poverty all throughout Africa, which doesn't make any sense. That's a contradiction. You should point that out to your judge, and like it basically makes their thing like pretty bad. Okay, another question. For intervening actors, is it basically just a non-unique that says that outside organizations concepts solve either way so the impact never triggers? Basically, yes. You can either phrase it as a non-unique or as an internal link response. I think they work as both. It just depends how it kind of fits better into your story and narrative of the round. But make sure you really nail down which intervening actors you're talking about because some judges won't buy it if you just go, someone else will solve the problem. You have to be specific, like, oh, the UN will try to solve this. NATO will try to solve this. And it especially helps if you have past examples of those organizations or countries doing something similar in the past. Uh, and yeah, that could be considered impact defense, internal link. Again, it just depends kind of where you put it in your speech. Okay, how would you go about fitting all your responses into the 4 minute time frame? I struggle with being concise. Yeah, okay, so this is one of the biggest things that second speakers and first speakers, honestly, especially for summary, have to learn is how to kind of squeeze all the things you want to say into 4 minutes. So this is kind of a little bit outside the scope of this lecture, but I'll answer it. As far as when you have prep, you should prep out your responses per contention. What I usually do is I'll take like my best responses that I can read in 2 minutes, and I'll have that. And then I'll also have a version of the best responses I can read in 1 minute or a minute and a half or in 1 minute, and I'll read that and I'll have that. And then based on how many contentions my opponents read, I'll choose either my like 2 minute version or my 1 minute version, or sometimes I'll just read all of them if they only have like one contention. And like so if I have it prepped out, that's the way to go. But with analytics, which is more what this lecture is about, it's obviously a little different. Um, with analytics, I would generally say, insofar as you should mostly be coming up with these when you're flowing the opponent's case, and then in Crossfire, hopefully, your partner, your first speaker, is setting up a lot of them for you. Um, you should literally just read as many as you can explain well. So, um, so like English, sorry. I would say try not to like focus on try not to focus on being super ultra concise with your words. Make sure A, the judge understands everything you're saying, and then B, you get through all the arguments. That's always your first priority. And then you can like go back and read whatever you have. And then as for tips for actual like word economy and being more concise, I just like to have a drill for that, which is where I'll give a speech. I call it, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty common drill, but it's like speech redos, right? So save your flows whenever you go to a tournament, whenever you do a practice round, save your flows, write down everything you said in rebuttal, in final focus, in summary, if you're a first speaker, whatever you're doing, and then give the speech and then try to give it again in 3 minutes and then 2 minutes and then 1 minute and fit as much content as you can into each block, getting like more and more concise with each one. But obviously you have to make sure that where you're staying still makes sense. And honestly, being more like concise is one of those things that just comes with practice. Like, it just takes like eventually your brain will just kind of get wired to go from saying, uh, their argument doesn't make any sense because XYZ to just like, judge, don't buy this because X, right? Just the most simplest version of your response. One more thing about that. Sorry, I know I'm going on about this like word economy thing a lot. I think a lot of people make the mistake of trying to like over explain their arguments, their responses, especially in tech rounds. Your response needs two things, a warrant and an implication. You need a warrant saying why like this response is true and an implication saying why it matters. That's it. 2 to 3 sentences. It doesn't have to be more than that, right? For the Ukraine thing we were talking about, Judge, Russia's not going to attack, Russia's not going to launch nukes because of mutually assured destruction. That means there's no nuclear war. They get no, wait, sorry, let me start over. Russia's not going to launch nukes because of mutually assured destruction, meaning they don't want to kill everyone. This means they don't get access to their impact, so you don't buy this argument. That's all you need. Don't go on trying to say more and more than that. Would you start weighing in rebuttal? Yes. If you have time, you should always weigh in rebuttal, especially second rebuttal. It's a really good way to set up the round. In lay rounds, I think it's literally the most broken strat on the planet. I like went like 5-1 and then finaled a late tournament with a mostly lay pool, literally just by spamming weighing and rebuttal. And a lot of our opponents like didn't adequately address it in their summaries. So yes, weighing and rebuttal is good if you have the time, and you should try to make the time if you can. Are your analytics done on the spot, or do you already have like non-uniques? Um, I would say, I mean, the main point of analytics is that you kind of do them as your opponent is reading their case or like on the spot, right? So like, and that's where like the process comes in, right? So as you're flowing your opponent's case, anything that makes you think that's weird, that doesn't make sense, that's a big number, write it down, pay attention, follow up on it. That's when you like kind of come up with them. I would say like I don't usually have analytics pre-written before a round unless it's from a previous round, like I said. Because whenever you face an argument and you read analytics, you should write down what you read, put it in your block doc, and save it for a rainy day. What happens if your partner does not set it up? That's fine too. You have to do like a teensy more explanation work. But honestly, like it doesn't matter that much. A lot of tech judges don't flow Crossfire anyway. It's just a kind of nice thing to have. Um, Second rebuttal is the rebuttal given by the second speaking team. So like you got the people who go first, they get first rebuttal, second rebuttal. Weighing in second rebuttal, which is right before first summary, is particularly strong because the other team only has a 3 minute summary to frontline everything and then counter your weighing and then do their own weighing. So it's hard. Okay. I think that's pretty much all I have as far as slides. So if anyone has, oh, never mind, there's one more I lied. I forgot about this. Frontlining. This is especially for second rebuttal because second rebuttal has to frontline everything that first rebuttal said. Real quick, just so we all know, frontlining is when you're defending your own case from the responses your opponents made. 90% of frontlining is analytic. And ideally, you should write out as much of it as you can pre-tournament. Again, you're not always going to get everything. In fact, you'll rarely get everything, but you want to get as much as you can so that that last little bit that you don't have written down is the only thing you have to think about when you're going through this frontlining. The reason most frontlining is done analytically is because at a certain point in a debate round, there's only so much time you have to read cards. So like it's really hard to just frontline with more cards. But yeah, the way to frontline, the best way to frontline is to go like take you and your partner, read your cases. I mean, you have to read out loud. You can just read through it. And then take your block doc, go to Google, and read every single response you can possibly think of on your own case. And then go to a document and start writing out front lines for all of them. Start writing out potential responses and their front lines, line by line, the whole thing, and go through it. And that way, and you can have those on like a separate doc. And that way, when you get spammed like 20 responses in first rebuttal, you don't have to take 2 minutes of prep. You can be like, all right, well, I already know what I'm going to say. You go up there, you read all your front lines that you should have done before. Again, not with cards, just analytics, and you're good. Another thing that I like to do is add in spikes. So occasionally when you're doing this drill of like responding to your entire case line by line, you'll notice, hey, that's like a really obvious response that I think our opponents are going to go for every single round. So instead of waiting until rebuttal to read it, you can just put it in your case, right? This is really strategic, especially in lay and flay rounds, because it can make your opponents stumble and it stops them from crafting the narrative they want using that response because you've already pre-responded to it. In tech rounds, it really doesn't matter as much because tech judges don't care about like story and appearance and narrative, but it's still something nice to have just to save you some time in rebuttal. Okay, that is the actual last slide. So now we'll just do questions. Can you give an example of a front line? Yes. So again, back to this Ukraine argument I've been referencing. Um, sorry. The argument was that Ukraine, Russia and the US and Ukraine are making a peace deal. If the US joins the ICC, it gets stopped, war, death, blah, blah, blah. A response that the other team would make, let's say you're reading this argument, a response the other team might make is, hey, you know, sorry, I just blanked really, really hard. A response the other team might make is, hey, Russia has cooperated with their ICC members in the past. Why wouldn't they work with America now? And then your front line defending your own case would be like, hey, this is uniquely different because Russia sees the US as weaponizing the ICC against it, right? So a front line is just a defense of your own case. Um, and then a spike is just if you put that in your own case. So for example, let's say I'm reading this argument and I'm on the link and I'm like, Russia will not cooperate, right? Russia will not cooperate. And I read my card saying Russia won't do it. And then I'll be like, they might try to say that Russia has cooperated with other ICC countries in the past, but this situation is unique because Russia thinks the US is weaponizing the court to attack it and its sovereignty feels threatened. That means war. And then you just read the rest of your case. So that's how like a spike would happen. Okay. Are there any more questions?
Yeah, I have a few. Um, so just to like I guess put it in my way just to make sure I'm getting like the concept of analytics right. Analytics are like responses that you make that don't have cards, but could they necessarily be pre-written or do they have to if like let's say I pre-write a response like a front line, but it doesn't have cards, is that considered like an analytic or
Yes. Basically, anything that isn't carded is considered an analytic. But I will say this lecture, aside from when I was talking about frontlining, was primarily geared towards responses you think of on the spot, because those are often the hardest and what people struggle with when they don't have prep. There's another question in the chat. What do you think about cross-applying case cards to frontline? I totally thought I put this on this slide, and I'm really sorry I didn't. I meant to talk about that. Yeah. You should absolutely extend and talk about your case cards when you're frontlining if it applies to their response, right? Which it does a lot of the time. A lot of times the evidence you read in case will directly talk about whatever response your opponent is going for. So yeah, absolutely go, hey, our McKernan evidence from case literally says Russia will feel threatened specifically by America because it's a world power trying to weaponize the court. So yeah, you should cross apply your case cards to front lines. Practice for analytics. Yes, the best drill for analytics is to if you're doing it with someone else, um, or even if you're doing it by yourself, just go to open case list, go to a topic you don't know all that much about, or one you do know about, but then you'll have to find like stranger arguments, I guess. So what I do is I usually just go to case list, go back like 3 years, click on a random case from like a good team, read the case, and then give myself 2 minutes to think of blocks to it. And then I'll like do the rebuttal. And then I'll say, okay, that was garbage. That one worked. That was garbage. That one worked. And then I'll keep going until I get a really good rebuttal. And then I'll start over with a new case and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. It just trains your brain to come up with these ideas of like, hey, that's a logic jump. That's a logic jump. That doesn't make sense. This is a double bind. This is a contradiction. And once you get good at that, then analytics will just be second nature. Or I should say, thinking of analytics on the fly will just become second nature. I can like barely hear you.
Oh, sorry. My mic was up on my head, but so if my opponents, let's say I'm like in a round and I'm reading analytics and they say like I don't have cards to support it, especially in front of like lay judges, like how would I necessarily respond?
I'm sorry, I totally zoned out. Can you repeat that? All I heard was lay judges.
Oh, basically, how do I respond if I'm running analytics and
Mhm.
my opponents say that like I don't have a card for it? How do I respond in a convincing way, especially in front of like a lay judge?
Um, I mean, there's a couple ways you could do it. You could like, come up with a fun catchphrase, but like, whatever, like, however you verbalize it, just find a way to point out that like evidence doesn't matter if you have a logical reason, right? Especially if you can back it up with empirics, but even if you can't, just say like, logic like matters more than like what some random dude on the internet posted on a website, right? If my logical reason makes sense and you don't have an argument against it, then the judge should believe it because like I'm giving them the logic. I don't know if that makes sense. But like in general, most lay judges are inclined to believe like logic over just trust me, my evidence, ha ha ha. Especially if you do a good job of pointing out, like, hey, I'm explaining my reasoning to you right now. They don't have a good response for it. You should believe that over whatever random author they're citing because you don't know what that author's thought process was. But you do clearly know, like, whose argument and logic you prefer more in this round. Something like that. As long as you're winning, like, the reasoning and warranting debate, that should work fine. It always has for me, at least.
Okay, thank you. And one last question.
Mhm.
Specifically, like I was interested in what you were talking about, like the double binds and how I just want to know more about like how they specifically work in the like basically how they become double binding in this sort of sense. Like if my opponents were to respond to one, then it kind of concedes the other. And how if I was in like the place of my opponents, how would I like respond to double bind?
Yeah. So double binds aren't perfect, right? They're not like, an amazing silver bullet, but they are very, very good. I should give a caveat here. They are good on the tech. They're kind of not good on the lay because lay judges go, he contradicted himself or she contradicted herself. Gasp, they must be stupid. And then they like get sad. But on the tech, double binds are a very powerful tool. And a double bind is kind of just this idea of, I mean, I think this is like a perfect example, right? Your opponents read an argument saying that Japan is giving out foreign aid, and after X, whatever happens, Japan will stop giving out foreign aid. And then you read two responses. First, you say Japan will be giving out foreign aid no matter what, meaning their link is not strong enough to affect it, or B, Japan will stop giving aid no matter what. Or sorry, or B, Japan is already stopping the giving of aid, right? So what you've basically done is combined a non-unique with saying their link doesn't matter. And what this does is it forces your opponents to sort of pick a strategy. They can either commit to the idea that, hey, our link means that like our link is super duper important, right? To respond to the first one, they'll say, "Oh, our link is super duper important. It's what single-handedly stops Japanese foreign aid." That is almost always a losing strategy because it just like it's very hard to get your judge to buy that, hey, this specifically all by itself will solve the whole problem. So instead, what a lot of teams do is say, right now, foreign aid is on the brink, right? Our link is not one thing by itself, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. But then when they argue that, you can say, okay, we agree. Japanese foreign aid is on the brink, which means it's going to fall off anyway because of some other event, which means your argument doesn't matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. So if I was like trying to like get out of like a tricky double bind situation, should I be saying like we're on the brink and it's not like we're not sitting on the either of the extreme ends of like what our
The,
opponents are
the
saying?
the best way to get out of a double bind is to just have really, really good uniqueness evidence. Because if you have uniqueness evidence and link evidence, I guess, sorry, that very explicitly says the only thing holding up X is our link, Y, then you're completely clear. If you don't have that evidence, A, find better uniqueness evidence, because uniqueness is one of the few things in round that you can't just like explain away. You just need to have good evidence. Or B, the other thing you could try to do is essentially argue our link is a drastic and dramatic change that has like nothing similar to it. So, for example, let's go back to the Ukraine example, right? America joining the ICC would anger Russia in an unprecedented way because America has never joined any institution that openly has tried to arrest the Russian leader, right? So that's like a dramatic, drastic departure from the norm that doesn't like is unlike anything else, which is why our link is specifically and uniquely important. Or you could just find really fire uniqueness evidence. Those are like the two things you can do. Can't opponents point out double binds are contradicting? It depends. If they, I mean, like, like I said, in lay rounds, yes, they can, and it matters. So, like, which is why you should probably just pick whichever one you think is stronger and go for it. In tech rounds, sure, but it doesn't matter because they're going to have to address both anyway. Sure, the responses contradict each other, but unless they respond to both, one of them is considered dropped and they're cooked and their argument is cooked anyway, right? So like just two responses contradicting each other doesn't automatically take both of them out of the round entirely. Your opponents still have to respond to both of them individually, which is like difficult. Okay, how to find better uniqueness evidence? Google. So like, um, you ideally like the best way I've had this explained to me is there's a psycho on the internet out there who believes literally any opinion ever expressed in the world. And so there's always some author who has written an article on the internet that you can find, especially when it comes to policy positions, which is what most of debate is about, that has said something that agrees with your argument, right? And that's why these arguments are still popular despite the existence of double binds. On the Ukraine top or on the ICC topic, there were great cards and great pieces of evidence that were very specifically like Russia is signing the peace deal now, but Putin himself has said that the US joining the ICC would destroy it and cause war. Something like that, right? Those are the pieces of evidence you're looking for. I promise they exist, with the exception of like some really weird arguments, and even then they probably still exist. You just have to look a little bit harder.
Um, I have another question on like responding to double binds.
Yeah.
So like what I'm kind of getting in the sense for double binds is like your opponents kind of say either your argument happens regardless like of whatever the you do or it just never ends up happening. So would there be like a way possibly to like respond in a sort of gray zone where you're saying yes it will happen but only with like uniquely because of our
I mean, yeah,
argument?
that's what you're essentially trying to argue, right? So you want to find a way to differentiate your argument, explain why it's unique and why it falls in like the gray zone. I kind of like how you said that. Why it like uniquely falls in the gray zone of like um of of why it uniquely falls in the gray zone of like changing this specific thing. Like, no, it's not going to change in the status quo. Yes, this is a dramatic difference, and that's why it matters. It's unique. How would I recommend the research process? Google. When you get good at using specific Google research terms, use quotation marks to find specific terms. If you go to Google, you use like quotation marks, it'll force those words to be in your search arguments. You can end your Google searches with PDF, and you'll get a lot of more like policy brief oriented things, which will often have those uniqueness policy positions you're looking for. So those are just a couple tips. Um, I think Outreach has a research lecture on their channel. Either that or there's one upcoming in like a month or so. So that'll probably be a better place to ask questions about like this research process. Any more questions?
Yeah. I have just like one final question.
You're good.
Yeah, so for analytics, are they like generally preferred more by like lay judges or tech judges? Because I know maybe like sometimes in debates, like some debaters can overblow it, saying like, oh, they don't have evidence, and like that means like we're supported by like some like professional from like a well-known institution. So like in general, which types of judges would buy analytics better, like in your opinion?
I will say in my lifetime, I have never seen a judge who did not buy an analytic on face value just because it was an analytic. Because lay judges, if you say your response well, right? If you especially if you like give the implication well, which is the reason why it matters, and you tie it into like why you should win the round. Lay judges will almost always appreciate that story if like the logic is better than your opponent's. And tech judges will just flow it as a response that your opponents need to respond to. And if they don't meet the burden of like warranting to respond to it, then they just auto lose the argument. So I would say it works really, really well on both types of judges, which is one of the reasons analytics can be so powerful, even when you do have prep, but especially in the absence of prep. What is an example of a catchphrase on how logic is greater than evidence? I don't know, man. Every debater has their own catchphrases that they say, like I just random things. I don't know. I can't think of anything right now, but like just like you could be like judge. I like to ask the judge questions for like my rhetoric and catchphrases and stuff like that. Like, judge, who do you trust more? What do you trust more? Sorry, judge, what do you trust more? Your brain analyzing the logic I'm giving you, or some random person on the internet who wrote this article like at 4 a.m. in the morning? Something like that. Doesn't matter. Um, this might be a different question, but how do you find the internal link? Okay. So generally arguments will be structured with like uniqueness link, internal link, impact, like I was talking about. The internal link is generally the step right before they start yelling about extinction. So usually it's some sort of this causes war, this causes climate change, this causes a pandemic, right? Some sort of event that you can tell they're going to spin as catastrophic. And it'll be generally right after they talk about the topic, right? So again, going back to this heavily overused Ukraine example, when they talk about the topic, they go, oh, this causes the peace deal to end. And then right after that, they go, this causes war. And as soon as they say war, like alarm bell should be going off in your head, like, oh hey, that's an overblowing. That's an internal link, and that's a massively overblown internal link, a logic jump that doesn't make sense. Okay. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a final question. It kind of pertains to this lecture, kind of not. But like in general, I've been very confused about links. Like the definitions of links, because some people tell me um the difference between a link and an internal link is that the link is what directly is like the very first part of the chain from your topic to like the impact. It's just the first part of the chain, whereas other people say it's from the topic to the internal link, where the internal link is the last part of the chain till your impact. So do you like could you help
I
me
would say the
clarify that?
second definition is probably better. They're very similar. I would say the second definition is probably better, Usually the way people will refer to that entire sequence that you're talking about from the topic to the internal link is a link chain. So you can either think of it as like several links, but like they're all basically a link, and then like you can attack each part of it if you want. But yeah, I would say the second definition is probably stronger.
Oh, so basically, like they're all like links on the link chain, but like that
Yeah,
very last one that links the final link to
the
the
impact.
impact is the internal
Yeah.
link. Okay. I mean, yeah, thank you.
And the longer, oh, this is one more thing that I mean, we'll probably end after this. If you have any more questions, or let me say this first. Um, the longer your opponent's link chains, which is kind of the like steps of like logic they had to take to get to their impact are, the more likely it is that some like random BS happened in the middle, right? Like I heard someone go from like the I heard someone go from the International Criminal Court to the Constitution to food to illegal immigrants to deportation to a tech race with China to nuclear war. And it's like there were so many steps in that logic chain that I know for certain at some point something went wrong and was crazy. So like if you ever hear a really, really long logic chain or link chain, there's probably some incoherence there. Okay, we'll probably wrap it up here. If you have any more questions, feel free to DM me. I'm pretty active on the outreach server, so I'll probably see it. Or just email me at my first name dot my last name, arush.tiyyagura@gmail.com. This video will be posted on outreach, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.